Don't try to pull any tricks, he said, it doesn't pay to fool with me. Then she said to him, God be with you, why are you so suspicious? I'd gladly go down and get it for you myself, but my legs are bad, I can't manage the ladder. I'll stand on the top step and hold the light for you. Don't worry, I'll send my daughter down with you, she said. That was me she meant. Oh, God in heaven, need I tell you how I felt when I heard that? Well, that's the end of me, I thought, and everything went black in front of my eyes and my legs wouldn't hold me up, I thought I'd fall down. But that devil, he was no fool, he took one look at both of us and screwed up his eyes and grinned at her, showing all his teeth, as much as to say, I know your tricks, you can't fool me. He could see that I meant nothing to her, I wasn't her own flesh and blood, so he made a grab at Pentia and picked him up in one hand and pulled up the trap door with the other. Let's have a light, he said to her, and down he went down the ladder into the cellar with Pentia. I think she was already cracked and couldn't understand anything. Her mind was gone. As soon as he had gone down with little Pentia, bang, she slammed the trap door and locked it and began to drag a heavy trunk on top of it, nodding and beckoning to me to help her, because it was too heavy for her. She got it in place and sat on it, pleased with herself, the crazy woman. No sooner had she sat down than the robber started yelling and banging on the floor. You couldn't make out what he was saying, the floorboards were too thick, but you could tell from his voice what he meant. Let him out or he'd murder Pentia. He roared worse than a wild beast to frighten us. Now your Pentia's in for it, he yelled, but she couldn't understand a thing. She just sat there winking at me and laughing, as much as to say, no matter what you do, I won't budge from the trunk and I'll keep the keys. I did everything I could with her. I screamed right into her ears saying she must open up the cellar and save Pentia, and I tried to push her off the trunk, but I couldn't, she was too strong for me and she wouldn't listen. Well, he was banging on the floor, and the time was going by, and she just sat there rolling her eyes, not listening to anything. Well, after a time, oh, God in heaven, I've been through many things in my life, but this I'll never forget. As long as I live I'll hear Pentia's thin little voice. Little Pentia cried and groaned down below, the little angel, that devil choked him to death. Now what shall I do, what shall I do with this mad old woman and this murderer, I thought. And I had to do something. The moment I thought this I heard Udaloy neighing outside. He'd been standing out there in the yard and he hadn't been unharnessed. Yes. Udaloy was neighing as much as to say, let's fly quickly, Tanya, and find some good people and get help. I looked out of the window and I saw that it was near dawn. You're right, Udaloy, it's a good idea, I thought. Let's go. But hardly had I thought this when again I heard, like a voice calling from the wood, wait, don't hurry, Tanya, we'll do it another way. And again I knew I wasn't alone in the wood. It was like our own cock crowing. An engine hooted down below. I recognized its whistle. It was from the engine that they always kept ready at Najernaya, a pusher, they called it to help freight trains up the hill. This was a mixed train going by, it always went by at that time every night. Well, I heard this engine I knew, calling me from below. I listened and my heart leapt. Am I off my head, I wondered, like Auntie Marfa, that every living beast and every dumb engine speaks to me in plain Russian? Well, it was no good thinking, the train was getting near, there was no time to think. I grabbed the lantern, there wasn't much light yet, and I raced to the track and stood right in the middle, between the rails, waving the light up and down. Well, what more is there to say? I stopped the train. Because of the wind it was going slowly, very slowly, almost at a crawl. I stopped it and the driver, who knew me, leaned out of the window of the cab and called out something. I couldn't hear what it was because of the wind. I shouted to him, the signal house had been raided, murder and robbery, a killer in the house, help us, comrade uncle, we need help right away. And while I was saying this, Red Army men came jumping out of the train, one after the other. It was an army train, they jumped out on the track. "What's up?" they asked. They couldn't make out why on earth the train had stopped in the wood, on a steep hill at night, and was standing still. I told them everything. They dragged the murderer out of the cellar. He was squealing in a voice thinner than Penchia's. "Have mercy on me, good people," he said, "don't kill me, I'll never do it again." They took the law into their own hands. They dragged him out onto the tracks, tied his hands and feet to the rails, and drove the train over him. I never even went back for my clothes, I was so frightened. I asked them to take me along in the train, and they put me on the train and off I went. After this, I wandered over half our own country and others with the bizprazorness. I don't know where I haven't been. I'm not exaggerating. What happiness, what freedom now, after all I suffered as a child. Though it must be said that there was also much sin and misery. But all this came later, I'll tell you about it some other time. That night I was telling you about, a railway official came off the train and went to the house to take charge of the government property, and to decide what to do about Auntie Marfa. Some say she never recovered and died in a madhouse, but others say she got better and came out. For a long time after hearing Tanya's story, Gordon and Dudorov strolled about under the trees in silence. Then the truck came. It turned clumsily off the road into the clearing, and the crates were loaded onto it. Gordon said, "You realize who this Tanya is?" "Yes, of course. Evgraf will look after her." Gordon added after a pause. It has often happened in history that a lofty ideal has degenerated into crude materialism. Thus Greece gave way to Rome, and the Russian Enlightenment has become the Russian Revolution. There is a great difference between the two periods. Bloch says somewhere, "We, the children of Russia's terrible years." Bloch meant this in a metaphorical, figurative sense. The children were not children, but the sons, the heirs, the intelligentsia, and the terrors were not terrible but sent from above, apocalyptic. That's quite different. Now the metaphorical has become literal, children are children and the terrors are terrible, there you have the difference. 5 or 10 years later, one quiet summer evening, Dudorov and Gordon were again together, sitting at an open window above Moscow, which extended into the dusk as far as the eye could reach. They were looking through an album of Yuri's writings that Evgov had put together, a book they had read more than once and almost knew by heart. They read and talked and thought. By the time they came to the middle of the book it was dark and they turned on the light. And Moscow. Right below them and stretching into the distance. The author's native city, in which he had spent half his life. Moscow now struck them not as the stage of the events connected with him but as the main protagonist of a long story. The end of which they had reached that evening, book in hand. Although victory had not brought the relief and freedom that were expected at the end of the war. Nevertheless the portents of freedom filled the air throughout the post-war period, and they alone defined its historical significance. To the two old friends, as they sat by the window, it seemed that this freedom of the soul was already there. As if that very evening the future had tangibly moved into the streets below them, that they themselves had entered it and were now part of it. Thinking of this holy city and of the entire earth. Of the still living protagonists of this story. And their children, they were filled with tenderness and peace, and they were enveloped by the unheard music of happiness that flowed all about them and into the distance. And the book they held seemed to confirm chapter 17, the poems of Yuri Zhivago, Hamlet. The stir is over. I step forth on the boards. Leaning against an upright at the entrance, I strain to make the far-off echo yield acute to the events that may come in my day. Night and its murk transfix and pin me, staring through thousands of binoculars. If thou he willing, Abba, Father, remove this cup from me. I cherish this, thy rigorous conception, and I consent to play this part therein. But another play is running at this moment, so, for the present, release me from the cast. And yet, the order of the acts has been schemed and plotted, and nothing can avert the final curtain's fall. I stand alone. All else is swamped by Pharisaism. To live life to the end is not a childish task. March the sun is hotter than the top ledge in a steam bath. The ravine, crazed, is rampaging below. Spring that corn-fed, husky milkmaid is busy at her chores with never a let-up. The snowy's wasting. Pernicious anemia, see those branching veinlets of impotent blue? Yet in the cow barn life is burbling, steaming, and the tines of pitchforks simply glow with health. These days, and these nights also. With eavesdrop thrumming its tattoos at noon, with icicles cacectic hanging on to gables, and with the chattering of rills that never sleep. All doors are flung open in stable and in cow barn. Pigeons peck at oats fallen in the snow. And the culprit of all this and its life begetter, the pile of manure, is pungent with ozone. Holy Week, the murk of night still prevails. It is yet so early in this world that the sky even now flaunts its countless stars, and each star is radiant as the day. And if the earth could really have its way, it would sleep through all of Eastertide to the droning of the psalms as a lullaby. The murk of night still prevails. The creation's hour is yet so early, the square extends like eternity from one corner to the other, and there is still a millennium until the dawn and warmth come. The earth is stark naked yet. It hasn't got a stitch to wear of nights to ring the bells, or to chime in of its own accord, with choirs singing. From Maundy Thursday right up to the very eve of Easter, the waters gnaw at river banks, and are busy weaving their currents, whirlpools, and eddies. The forest, too, is stripped, exposed, and all through Passiontide the trunks of pines stand in a throng like worshippers aligned in prayer. While in the town, not too far off, the trees stand mother naked too, as if about to enter church and peering within its gratings. Their gaze is overcome with awe, nor is their panic hard to fathom. The gardens leave their boundary walls, the laws that govern the earth are shaken, a god is being interred. They see a glow about the altar screen, and the black pall, and tapers in a row, and faces all in tears. And a procession suddenly emerges bearing the cross and shroud, and comes toward them. 2 birches guarding the portals have to step aside and yield the right of way. The procession makes a circuit of the church grounds, walking along the very curb of the pavement, and brings in from the street within the portals the spring, and all the murmurings of spring, an air that has about it the tang of consecrated wafers and of the heady fumes of spring. And March scoops up the snow in the porch and scatters it like alms among the halt and lame, as though a man had carried out the ark, and opened it, and distributed all it held. The singing lasts until the glow-off dawn. The voices, having sobbed their fill, are more subdued. Their chanting of the psalms and gospels floats out more and more faintly until it reaches wastelands under lonely lamps. And when the midnight comes, all creatures and all flesh will fall silent on hearing spring put forth its rumor that just as soon as there is better weather, death itself can be overcome through the power of the resurrection. White night, I have visions of a remote time. A house on the Petersburg side of the Neva. You, the daughter of a none too well-off landed proprietress, the land being out in the steppes, are taking courses and were born in Kursk. You are a darling, you have admirers. This night you and I